Thank you all for being here, staying here for the second half of our really big show, as Ed Sullivan used to say, which is the panel discussion. And I will remind you to please silence your cell phones in case you turn them on during the break. So thanks so much to our 5 readers, Alison Deming, John Elder, Jody Gladding, Jane Hirshfield, and Nalini Nadkarni for their thoughtful and moving poems and prose pieces. Now we're going to listen to them in this panel discussion, talk about the interplay of poetry and science, addressing their ongoing efforts to give voice to the natural world, to talk about commonalities and differences in their scientific or poetic approaches to environmental concerns, and how best to integrate and assimilate these bases of knowledge, the objective, dispassionate, fact-based writing of science, the subjective, empathetic image-making of poetry. How might we use their complementary powers to heighten awareness of our present ecological plight? I think you've heard them answer some of these questions in the reading, but we'll hear more from them. And maybe I'll repeat a quote. I had it here, but Nalini already said it. I will repeat what one of the things she said, and it was from an essay she published years ago in, of all places, Poetry magazine. You remember, Nalini is a botanist by trade, but she says, perhaps the deepest value of poetry for scientists is its articulation of feelings that scientists themselves harbor for what they study: passion, deep curiosity, and a sense of stewardship for the natural world. We rarely reveal these emotions to our scientific peers, especially if we rely solely upon the vocabulary of science. By contrast, poetry sets these emotions free, encapsulating the joy and ultimate reasons for our research. And so I'm going to turn it over to Alison Deming, who will serve as our moderator for the panel discussion. And the panel will go from now until, let's say, 5:45, after which we will hang out. I think the books will still be for sale. Anyone who didn't get a book signed, will be your second chance. And I just hope we will then just continue the conversation here and beyond here. Thanks.
Thanks, Neil. Do we have to do anything to make this on? Sounds on. Okay. Thank you so much. I have the formidable and delightful task of helping these people reveal their brilliance to you. Once again, you already know how much they have to offer. So I will be asking them questions, but I'm going to start out with some opening remarks to try to set the mood and the stage. Environmental poetry in the time of climate change. We were in a very different place as a society a year or more ago when Neil and I began discussing our hopes for this gathering. What we felt then as an urgency has now become an emergency. Both art and science are being defunded, eroded, censored, silenced, betrayed. Medical research shut down, climate science denied, environmental protections crushed, laws shredded, words banned from the federal lexicon. Climate change, emissions, when these very words are a crash course in the advance of an ecocide being committed in the interests of the wealthy few for whom too much is never enough. The daily barrage of cruelties, injustices, and humiliations of our national identity on the world stage are enough to put a person in a state of perpetual outrage or numbness. In times of profound change, people turn to poetry for meaning and community. As former poet laureate Tracy K. Smith has written, one of poetry's great effects through its emphasis upon feeling, association, music, and image, things we recognize and respond to even before we understand why, is to guide us toward the part of ourselves so deeply buried that it borders upon the collective. Poets have always known the ground truth of ecology. Everything is connected. It is pointless to ban words. They are our collective possession. And we have a lot of other words. And we have our freedom of speech, though it's coming at a higher cost for many of our neighbors and kin. We're here today to celebrate poetry and science, two of the very best instruments we have for knowing where we're at and where we need to go, and explore how we might go about that in alliance. Science generates new knowledge. It's method-based on verifiable evidence. It asks a question, then tries to figure out how to answer that question in a manner that can be verified and repeated by others. We're living in the age of science. We need science to deal with the challenges and complexities of the world we have made. But how do we speak of the feelings and thought experiments that new findings in science induce in us? The wow factor of learning that a slime mold can create a map of the Tokyo subway system? Really? How do we speak of the technological marvel of the James Webb Telescope, the work of 20,000 people in 14 different countries collaborating over 20 years, and this at a time when it seems impossible for people to work together for the common good? How do we speak of our empathy for those who suffer? How do we speak of the sublime beauty that abounds in nature? In the face of the challenge of climate change, an upwelling of poetry and science collaboration is emerging. And it's been going on for a while, but now it's kind of exploding, and we'll hear more about that. Call it a community of the curious, experimenting with new ways of scientific storytelling. Many scientists understand that they can and must do a better job of communicating their findings to the public. In no matter is this more important than climate change that affects every living being on this gorgeous and wounded planet. It's all about global warming, baby, writes C.D. Wright in Casting Deep Shade. We are the asteroid. Poetry can help scientists communicate with broader audiences, can explore ethical and aesthetic dimensions of scientific discoveries. Poetry can dwell in uncertainty without grasping for facile truth or lies to cover up the truth. Poetry can bring wonder back to minds fatigued with information overload. Ask me if I speak for the snail, writes Camille Dungy in her poem, Characteristics of Life, and I will tell you, I speak for the snail. I speak for the damselfly. I speak for the moon jelly. Plus, it's just plain fun and fascinating for poets to hang out with scientists. So, science can also contribute to aesthetic experience, to questions of beauty, questions that science does not ask, writes Potawatomi botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer. And because they aren't important, not because they aren't important, but because science as a way of knowing is too narrow for the task. The universe becomes more beautiful after Galileo enhances our ability to see it with a telescope. The elephant more beautiful after we understand that it experiences grief. Aesthetic experience explores new language for bringing together ways of knowing, questions of what we know and how we know it, confesses our failures and ignorance, shares our anxiety and grief, educates our empathy. Kim Stanley Robinson, the great science fiction novelist, says that it is the role of the arts and humanities to aim science. How brazen for poets to suggest they might be able to aim science. Well, we don't need to aim Nalini anywhere. So we couldn't have more gifted minds to explore this terrain of alliance, and I am thrilled to be here with you today. So I'm going to ask you these questions. You can roll with them any way that you wish, because that's the way your minds work, I know. So let me start, and maybe this time let's just go right down the line, okay? So the first question. We've seen that new relationships between science and poetry are emerging, inspired by climate change. So we think these relationships can really empower us, and I'm interested to hear from each of you, beyond what you provided in your readings, to know what has inspired the aspects of your work that draw upon both poetry and science. So Nalini, could you get us started?
Yes. I think that poetry has inspired me ever since I was a little kid, reading poetry and climbing trees, because poetry stirred me. it stirred me to think about the woods. It stirred me to think about people interacting with trees. And I see that poetry stirs other people in ways that perhaps science does not. And because I'm so passionate about thinking about trees and how important they are, how essential they are, and yet how they do not have voices, that trees are silent and they're sessile. And so there's this tendency to overlook them. And I look, for example, at National Geographic documentary films, much as I love National Geographic, and much as I love cougars and pumas and cheetahs and lions and tigers, I still get angry that 95% of nature documentaries are made about animals instead of plants. And so I guess I have always felt that by whatever means I can, by whatever collaborations I might forge, by whatever media I might use, if it can be used by myself and others to muster awareness, to raise support, to motivate actions, then I think that's a worthy tool, so to speak, a worthy way of knowing and communicating that I would like to pursue.
Thanks. Jody?
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to say you are like the best reader of poetry. I was like, wow, that's how that poem should be read. So that's maybe being a scientist. That's that happened. My answers to this are much more sort of, I was thinking about what, like my daily practices and how science feeds into them. And I would say, I read Thoreau's journal every morning. Like I read it for the day it is. And I've done this for probably 15 or 20 years. I can't think of how many, you probably know this, John, how many years he kept it. But it's about that wide. I have a little Dover one, so it's like 2 big volumes. But so every day I'm looking at something that Thoreau wrote on this day 160 years ago. And inevitably they're field observations. You know, he's saying, today, he says, I think the gentian is closing, and I'm noticing the elm leaves are dropping, but they're not yellow yet, or something. So I read that, and then he's in Concord, Massachusetts, I'm in Vermont, but, you know, basically the same season. So sort of, oh yeah, I've seen that too, you know, or there aren't elms anymore, right? I mean, that it's sort of a way of, it's connecting to I would call him a scientist as well as a poet, a naturalist, observing and connecting it immediately to my day. So that's one way. I studied at Cornell with A.R. Ammons, and so I think the beginning of my poetry learning came from a person who was eminently a scientist and a poet. And the things, and they have never been unentwined for me. I still cry when I read his poems. There's no way in which science and poetry are not intertwined for me from the get-go. So I would say that, and I look at field guides all the time. I mean, if I'm out looking at things, I come in and see if I can find them in the book and learn about them. That it's sort of on that level that those things go on. And I would say also my reading, just a couple books I've read in the last couple years, which I would recommend. I don't know, do you know this one, Turning to Stone? It's called Turning to Stone. Turning to Stone, Discovering the Subtle Wisdom of Rocks. And it's written by a geologist who is of our generation. And she's a geologist who majored in English and geology as an undergrad. So the geologist in your class, you know, that kind of phenomenon. And she interweaves her life story with the life story of rocks. And so each chapter is a different kind of rock. And she does an amazing job making the life of rocks come alive as, you know, really there, like they're dynamic in their lives. And so I would recommend that one. And then this one I just came upon because I was assigned to translate it, but happily, it's called Lichens. And this is another orientation. The person who wrote this, Vincent Zanca, is a literary person, but he takes lichens and just runs with them. So it's the whole, the science of lichens and how interesting and complex they are as a being, a form of life, and then also all the art and history that around lichens. And he chooses them because they are incredibly resilient. I mean, that's the thing. His idea is that lichens are the most resilient thing on the planet and have figured out how to live symbiotically with everything else. So they're a model, and they're just beautiful illustrations in here. Besides being really fascinating, they're just beautiful images, some of which artists have now taken and blown up into landscapes. So like the whole interesting architecture of the lichen becomes a place to live. And that's an artistic, like you take something and you make it bigger, and suddenly it's something totally different and becomes not a thing but a site. So those are just two.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just interesting hearing how sort of naturalist observation and poetry are just very unified in your practice. Thanks, Jody. John?
Here I am. Well, it's such a pleasure today, and so many things I'd like to say, just following up directly on what Jody just said about A.R. Ammons. I was cutting and cutting to try to get down to under 8 pages. That was my goal. And one of the things I cut was a brief discussion of A.R. Ammons' poem, Hymn, because if you want to have scientific terminology in poetry, he's got a line that goes, sporangia, microvilli, and the simplest solenterates. That's even better than carbonates. But it's not random. I mean, he's deeply versed in science, and it's robust in the same ways. And also, I wanted to mention again, Jody mentioned the Robert Frost sequence ending with the Hill Wife. My best teacher of Vermont natural history has been Robert Frost. We were living in Northern California, my wife and I went to graduate school in the East, and I was lucky enough to get a job at Middlebury College. And we thought we'd just stay for a while and go back to Northern California, because who wouldn't? But in fact, we fell in love with it here, decided we'd like to make our life here if we could. And so then I packed up my backpack with field guides and started hiking all around the mountains, trying to learn about the natural history of Vermont. Oops, did I just do something? And what I found was that my best teacher actually was Robert Frost. Robert Frost was a wonderful naturalist. He was an ace botanist. Wherever he went, he carried his flora of New England with him. He was very sophisticated about evolution and ecology, and especially forest succession. And so again and again, his poems had information for me about the life of these woods and the settlement history of Vermont. So he was a great teacher, and because of him, I began to write about this in Vermont, and I got a contact from a guy who was an ecology professor in Massachusetts, who began to bring his classes to me so that we could read Robert Frost together and talk about New England natural history. And then I would go to his classes, and we would read Robert Frost again, but to help them see some of the connections we made. We ended up publishing together. We wrote a joint essay on Frost's poem, Spring Pools, where Frost really understood water tables better than most people in his day. So for me, it's been inseparable. My poetic tastes have developed in this dialogue. And the other thing is, I got to teach at a liberal arts college, where I often taught with scientists, and learned so much from them. Sometimes they made fun of me because of my inadequate formulation of things. I remember one of my friends, a statistically oriented physicist, once in front of a class, told me that how did he put it? I didn't know an asymptote from a hole in the ground. so I took my knocks from this, but it was so much fun to have such colleagues.
Okay, so the question was, what inspired us to get into this particular intersection? And for me, the prime first answer is the answer of a young child, curiosity. You know, I was a curious child in every direction, and I remain so to this moment. One of my favorite books is by the early childhood development professor at Berkeley, Alison Gopnik, The Scientist in the Crib. And what she says is the qualities of an infant are to be open-minded and experimental, and that scientists are just infants who never grew up. And the same, I think, is true of artists and poets. The second thing which inspired me was simply the desire to have as capacious a vocabulary of both inquiry and expression as is available. And, you know, science is pretty much the language of this moment. We live in an age of technology and an age where, for those of us who are still interested in such things, where really when you try to understand something, science is often the first place that people turn. It used to be history, philosophy, theology. The quality of inquiry of our particular generation has been scientific inquiry. And, you know, just like that poem that I read earlier, where, you know, I was devastated from my first long love ending. And what do I use? Physics terms, because they were at hand, because somewhere I had learned them, and I needed them for that poem. The third thing which inspired me and drew me into what my life currently looks like is a simple rebellion against the separation of our human lives into silos. You know, I don't believe in silos. And so, you know, yes, it's true, I don't really understand, you know, the workings of the genes and DNA all that precisely, but to the extent that I am capable of learning that, it's mine. You know, it's all of ours. It doesn't belong to other people. And the last thing would be so I've gone from childhood to, you know, this moment. And, you know, the inspiration of this moment is, alas, outrage. It is an absolute sense of shock that the sciences are being disregarded and disrespected, and that anyone could think that what poets want and what scientists want and what human beings want is anything other than allegiance to reality augmented by imagination is just beyond me. So.
Thank you. You made me think of something Alan Weissman said, the two of you particularly, when he wrote his most recent, he's a wonderful environmental journalist, Hope Dies Last, this is his latest book, a very important book, but I asked him, how the heck do you handle all of that research and put it into a narrative? He said, I talk to the scientist and I say, explain it to me like I'm a 6-year-old, and then he can get it. So one of the things that we're all struggling to do is to get beyond polarized and bifurcated ways of thinking and perceiving and going about our problem solving and our activism. And, you know, there's a tired old thing from C.P. Snow about the two cultures, and they just can't possibly ever communicate, science and the literary field. But we're in a place now where we have so many fields to call upon to inform us that keep telling us that these fields are not in opposition. And I'm extremely interested to ask these panelists, like, how they think that, for example, non-Western or indigenous perspectives can help us change this bifurcated view of the world, and particularly help us redefine what we mean by the environment. And I might ask for John to take the lead, and then we'll move on to Jody, and we'll just shake up the order for this time.
All right. I think that's an excellent question, and my sense is that, in fact, indigenous perspectives on poetry and science are both helping us move forward with the kind of dialogue we want to have. In terms of also our language, one of the things poets do is to look deeply into language so that it begins to veer and shift and other terms come up. The language that we use about nature is often critiqued by Native American writers, like Leslie Marmon Silko. She wrote an essay, a wonderful essay called Landscape History and the Pueblo Imagination, that is the best takedown I know of Western ways of talking about wilderness. For her, growing up in Laguna Pueblo, northern New Mexico, all culture is at once natural and human. They're inseparable. The culture is rooted in the place. And in that essay, she says, what we have for a culture is stories, and the stories are keyed to places. And each of our stories in every scale is part of a bundle of stories in the medicine language of her people. And I'm a great fan of the wilderness movement and loved going to a wonderful conference on old growth recently. But I noticed that people are not using the word wilderness as much. We're talking about old growth or self-willed forests comes in because the implication, I don't think it was intrinsic, but the implication for many of wilderness was vast, untrammeled, and pristine outside the human realm. And Leslie Silko would say, that way of thinking about wilderness is used by people who don't know the stories. So that helps a lot, I think. And of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's been referred to here, is such a wonderful writer today because she speaks the language. She is a professional botanist, and she speaks standard Western science language, but she also speaks the language of her people. And not only the Potawatomi people, but the place where she lives now, around the Onondaga and those tribes. And she moved to walk in the woods. You know, you'll be walking in the woods with Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she'll be pointing something in, and she'll pick a little wild strawberry and say, "This is the king of the berry people." And it's not arch, and it's not twee. It's just rich, and it's authentic. And so I do think that. That there's a way in which the indigenous voice is going to be central to the dialogue of poetry and science.
Thank you. Jody?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. John had mentioned that essay. Oh. John had mentioned that essay in an email exchange, and I went and found it. And the word it is language that we need to think about here, and the word that the word landscape she focuses on, and I want to just share what she says about it, and then look at Francois Julien, who's a French sinologist, and talks about the differences between Chinese culture, ancient Chinese culture, and our culture, and the word landscape is central to both of these. So what Leslie Marmon Silko says is, as long as human consciousness remains within hills, canyons, cliffs, clouds, and plants and sky, the term landscape, as it entered the English language, is misleading. And this is in quotes, a portion of territory the eye can comprehend in a single view. So it's the idea that the landscape is something out there, we're here, often it's the backdrop, right? A portion of territory, does not correctly describe the relationship between the human being and his or her surroundings. This assumes the viewer is somehow outside and separate from the territory he or she surveys. Viewers are as much a part of the landscape as the boulders they stand on. There is no high mesa edge or mountain peak where one can stand and not immediately be part of that surrounds. Okay, so just that notion that, somehow in the West we've come to the conclusion that we are not in it, we are not of it. And this is what Julien says, and it's amazingly parallel. Now, China offers us an entirely other entry into what we call landscape. The Chinese term is mountains and rivers. That's the actual term for landscape, shan shui, and it's two characters, mountains, rivers. The term dates from antiquity and is still used today in modern Chinese. It has not been replaced and has never been altered, even in contact with European influences. And you can see this in painting. I mean, that's where the term originated. The term landscape in English originated. If you think of landscape, Chinese landscape paintings, there's never an out there. There's a here, and you're in it. You're part of it, looking at it. You can't. There's not that sense of perspective that has been imposed by our way of thinking. But doesn't conceive of landscape as a portion of the country offered to the view of an observer, but as a dynamic correlation between opposites, mountains and rivers, or mountains and waters. On the one hand, there's that which tends toward height, mountain. On the other, that which tends toward depth, water. The vertical and the horizontal, high and low, both opposing and responding to one another. There's that which is immobile and remains impassive, mountain, and that which is constantly moving, ceaselessly rippling and flowing, permanence and variance, both confronting and combining with each other. There's that which has form and makes contours, and there's that by which nature is without form and adopts the form of the things. Opaque and transparent, solid and dispersed, stable and fluid, mixing together and enhancing one another. Finally, there's that which appears before the eyes, mountain, and that which is heard, water, eye and ear equally called upon. In the place of landscape, a unitary term, the Chinese mountains, rivers, names a play of endless interactions between factors, contradictory and coupled, yin and yang, by which the world is fundamentally conceived and organized, and from which the human is not separate, but remains within all the many implications in this world among mountains and waters. So that just seems so central to, a different way of approaching all of this.
Could I add to that?
Yeah.
The word landscape is so intriguing. In the history of ecology, ecology is a study of the interactions between plants, animals, and their environments. In the early days of ecology, we were fixated on individual species and their interactions, which then sort of evolved into understanding these species as interacting as communities, many plant communities, many animal communities being included into what we began thinking of as ecosystems, a prairie ecosystem, a mountainous ecosystem, a river ecosystem. But what to me has been really an amazing development in the field of ecology is the development of and the naming of the discipline we call landscape ecology. This was started by a woman named Monica Goigel-Turner at University of Wisconsin, who recognized that ecosystems sort of have boundaries. You look at a forest next to a savanna or a prairie, and there's a line between them. And we used to think of them as, oh, I need to study this forest ecosystem, or I'm going to choose to study this prairie ecosystem. But what Monica and her colleagues began realizing is that they're not separate. When you just get up a little bit higher in terms of your spatial level of organization, the forest and the savanna interact. There's movement of organisms and microorganisms across. And so now ecologists would never think of just saying, I'm just going to study this forest ecosystem, but instead are thinking about landscapes, which brings us back to what you were talking about with this sort of more ancient Chinese idea of mountain and waters, right? So I would say that this might be a more maybe what we think of as an indigenous attitude of everything is connected, everything is reciprocal, but it is permeating this discipline of Western ecological thinking. And so I don't want to only attribute these kind of everything's connected and everything is reciprocal only to indigenous people. I think now there is this realization, there is this embracing even of the most Western modern ecologists and scientists into understand this new understanding or old understanding that things are connected, that things are reciprocal, and that we have to not put our blinders on, but take them off in order to understand and to predict what might be happening in the future, especially as we think about disturbing one or the other.
Thanks. Jane? Okay. Boy, we've already gotten to so many things one could say. So I am going to echo the phrasing of the question was indigenous and non-Western. And because I am, amongst other things, a 50-year practitioner of Soto Zen, I will just say words that Nalini just used. The Buddhist sense of existence as interconnected, interdependent, dependent, and that any fixed idea of self, whether you want to call that, a particular mountain or river, or my name is Jane, is not non-existent. It is. You have to take care of your own life, but it is provisional. And it is, it is one way of seeing to have a self named Jane. And when I say a self named Jane, I'm perhaps completely ignoring the fact that every breath I take is in communication with the green beings of the world who have received my carbon dioxide and oxygen and who have given me my carbon dioxide and oxygen. We are parts of other things. So that was the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is, Western, if you go back far enough, Western is indigenous. All of our stories, all of our myths are our heritage also. And one of the things which I have felt all my life, perhaps because, again, I was a peculiar child, but just this sense, everything is alive. Everything is alive. And, something that in literary criticism is often used as a don't do this, it's bad. It's called the pathetic fallacy, to ascribe life to an object. Well, you go back to Aristotle's Poetics, and he's praising it with what he says, it's the animating principle that, that makes poetry great. So, there's that. The third thing I wanted to say, just thinking, triggered by the landscape discussion, I couldn't help but think of a very short pebble poem of my own, which is so short I actually have it in my mind. I don't memorize my own poems. It's called Mountain and Mouse. Both move, one only more slowly. So, and that, thinking of that reminded me, one of my scientist friends is a geomorphologist of some note. He works on the first rover on Mars, the earlier one. He's still involved with that, and also, has gone all over this planet looking at this and that. And he takes friends for walks and tells us the stories of the landscape. And I just love this as, again, it sort of breaks down our ideas about things. He said, at least, where we were walking, the California coastal landscape, he said, the primary shaper of everything you're looking at? Gophers. Gophers are changing that fixed shape into a rounded shape and letting the water travel through. So again, just the humility of not getting so caught up. Maybe instead of Western, we should have used, the sort of Descartes language. Everything is connected, everything changes, everything can be looked at in multiple ways. And for me, this is a perspective that I have been trying to learn all my life. And it's not like when you hit your shin on the chair, you don't go, ouch, and think of it as, that object that I rather foolishly walked into. But the more that I can feel the world in other ways, the happier I feel.
Beautiful. Let's drift towards more practical questions, slightly more practical questions. For starters, I'd love to hear from you all. We've already heard a little bit about these things, a little bit more about specific projects where partnerships and projects might develop. We've heard a little bit about a class that actually brings students out into the field and just taking a walk with a geologist, what fun. But what are the science poetry partnerships projects that we might develop together across the disciplines? There have been poetry installations in zoos and natural history museums and national parks. If we've heard about Scientific American welcoming us to its pages, thank you. So what kind of collaborations would you all like to see as we try to actually do things boots on the ground, bringing these two disciplines, or whatever, they're multiple disciplines, but bringing these ways of thinking and ways of knowing and ways of seeing together in pragmatic ways? Nalini, you've done so much
you
of
bet.
this.
Well, certainly one of the things I think about is the personal interactions that happen between a scientist and a poet. And I think, Jane, you've done so much of this. I've done a little bit of this. But one of the things I think about is the bubbles that we usually circulate in ourselves, that you guys are circulating in poetry bubbles, just as I circulate with scientific bubbles, but to invite each other to our bubbles. And I can think of the Ecological Society of America meetings, for example, which is the professional society for ecologists like me. We have annual symposia, annual conferences, and I could definitely see getting together with Jody or with any of the three of you to think of a symposium, to present a symposium, to propose that to the ESA, to say we would like to bring together ecologists and scientists to discuss how ecologists and poets might work together to put forward our work. So one forum could be scientific and poetry conferences. A second one is certainly field sites. And when I think of one of the most fabulous ecological field sites that I'm aware of, the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest in Oregon, they have a fabulous sort of environmental humanities, writer, poetry, artist in residence, where they actually bring poets and environmental humanist writers to the field site itself, who mingles with the scientists, mingles with the ecologists and technicians there, and usually produces just amazing poetry. So that's a second piece. I think a third way that we can think about doing this is something that my heart is very close to, and that is to get outside of our bubbles altogether. That we have, and I hate to say this, Neil, but when you offered me this invitation, I really hesitated about taking it on, because I think, just as when I give my National Geographic Society talks, I'm talking to people in the audience who already know the importance of trees and nature. And I'm sure that when you poets talk to other poets, they already know and rejoice in the wonder and the power of poetry. So one of the reasons I said, okay, I'm going to come to this conference here, the Sundog Symposium in Vermont, is not only to enjoy each other's company and the beautiful surroundings of Vermont, but also perhaps to put out the invitation to say, let us be more courageous about with whom we interact, with whom we speak, of the invitations we offer and the invitations we shove on other parts of society, so that we can do a better job of expanding beyond our own bubbles. And so I just really want to reiterate that we can go into prisons. We can go into juvenile detention centers. And I think from what I related earlier in my own remarks, when we bring a poet together with a scientist to a place like a juvenile detention center, we have a higher probability of having some sort of impact. And I think you heard some of that in the haikus and the poems that they read. And so I would just really ask you to think about, how might I go beyond my bubble? And I think I have one recommendation based on my own 20 years of experience of doing this, is that we have to approach it with what I call, and what philosophers call, intellectual humility. To put aside our own passion for the moment and just say, well, I'm passionate about trees and nature, but not everybody might be passionate about trees and nature in the same way I am. So what is it that another sector of society, another group of people might find a connection to, a thread into which we could weave them into the tapestry of understanding and care of nature? And there's an infinite number of threads that we can do that with. If there are hunters whom we think of like, oh, somebody's killing a deer, this beautiful deer, this innocent deer. Well, hunters really care about the environment and the ecosystem, because they have a value of wanting to hunt successfully. And so I can have conversations with hunters about climate change and how that's negatively affecting deer habitat. We can think about a senior assisted living center. My mom died when she was 97, but she could still have a conversation, and she loved the idea that I was studying old growth forests, because old trees, like old people, should be honored and respected, and there's a connection there then between old growth forests and people in senior assisted living centers. I think about fashion. Like, I always used to think about fashion as this horrible industry of consumerism, of inks that are polluting, of growing cotton with all these pesticides. But I also have to be intellectually humble about that, to realize that a lot of people care a lot about clothing. And so I've started a fashion line, and you can see my little jacket here, in which I print botanically correct images of plants and trees on clothing. And it comes with a little hang tag that has information about the biology and conservation of the species that's depicted. So when Neil says, or Alison says, "Hey, Nalini, I like your jacket," just like you did the first moment I saw you in the lobby of the hotel, I can start saying, "Well, let me tell you about Piper aretum. This grows in the canopy of the Monteverde cloud forest. It's the same plant genus of black pepper that you put on your scrambled eggs. And if you'd like to contribute to its conservation, since it's so beautiful, well, you can join the Nature Conservancy like I do, and you can participate and be part of the contributing to nature." So the medium of communication is something we think of as consumeristic, but if we can remove ourselves from being intellectually smug about fashion, we will have a chance of having conversations with people who care about clothing, even if they might not care about a particular species of tree. So I invite you to think about all kinds of ways that not just poets and scientists can do this, but that each of you can think about a social group or a group of people whom you already have connections with, you already have some understanding of their values, and connect that somehow to nature, to climate change, to making this world a better place. And Barbie dolls, exactly.
We want the catalog.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just ask Jane to step in if she wouldn't mind, because she's also been someone with
Yeah.
Poets for Science and
Yeah.
many projects of collaboration across the lines.
So what I loved about the way you introduced this question was you pointed out it's already happening all over. And I continue to learn, every other week I hear about some new interdisciplinary endeavor that I had never heard about before. So this is not rare. It's just that each of them, there's no national organization of interdisciplinary conversations, but it is not rare. It is happening already everywhere and needs to continue. And because every endeavor only reaches so far, and we just want everybody to come on board. So the first thing that happened to me, besides being curious as a youngster, was I was invited into an interdisciplinary conversation group when I was pretty young. And that was where I found out I loved talking with scientists. It's like, Lynn Margulis, the woman, the Gaia hypothesis, was part of this group. And her son with Carl Sagan was part of this group. And before my time, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson had been part of this group. And so were Gary Snyder and Wendell Berry. They had stopped going to meetings, so I got invited as a younger poet because they needed a poet who was going to show up. So that's one thing. Just, put together your own salons with people from your own community and get them talking to each other. Then I was, a guest at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And here again, how does one thing lead to another? When I was and I loved, when Nalini had her research graphic slides up, I saw the H.J. Andrews, and one of the authors was F. Swanson. Well, Fred Swanson was one of the people who actually figured out what was going on in the canopy of old-growth trees, which had never been studied because there were no drones. Nobody knew how to get up there and look. And I love this story. Sorry, it's a total detour. But the first thing they did was cut down a tree to try to look at the canopy. And of course, it went smash and everything scattered and they couldn't study anything. And then so these were three people getting their PhDs at the University of Oregon in forestry. And when they said they wanted to study the old-growth canopy, their advisors said, "Why would you want to do that? You won't have a career. In 25 years, there won't be any left." So, my personal feeling of debt to Fred Swanson is enormous. And he was who showed me around the Andrews. And he gave me a paper. They gave you a bunch of things to educate up the poets who were in residence there. And the writer, back then it was all, either prose writers or poets. Now they've expanded to bringing in artists from many fields. And amongst the papers he gave me was one called The Invisible Present. And The Invisible Present by John Magnuson, the title of it alone caught me. And in it was the idea that we cannot see change that happens either too slowly or too quickly to be observed by human brains tends to go unnoticed, to be invisible. And I remembered that paper for decades. And when I was given the request to give the annual lecture for the Academy of American Poets last year, I thought, I'm going to start off from that. And so I ended up writing a paper called Making the Invisible Visible, Some Thoughts on Poetry and Science, because both fields are doing that. So, you never know what little thing is going to lead to many, many more thoughts. I've also been the poet in residence. I didn't create this. It was given to me. At UCSF, there's a neuroscience department who was funded to have artists in residence, one a year. And so I was in residence with the neuroscience department. And that was where I learned how much the scientists loved bringing art to them. So part of my idea of, what am I in service of? Partly I'm just in service of the scientists. I am their handmaiden. I am their, and they write poems and they read poems and they give poems to their patients and it's just quite extraordinary. So then next thing was Poets for Science, which was born, as I told you in the reading, out of, I wrote a poem. And then I wrote another poem, and then I had to do something. So it becomes activism. And so the activism of getting poems into public places where we are calling for certain kinds of change, like that Orville Schell Coal and Ice exhibit, which goes up around the world every few years. It's in Paris or China or San Francisco or Washington, D.C. And that is a way of making the connection between facts and feeling happen, which is what activism is. It's when you take the facts of catastrophe and you feel them enough to do something about it. And that is what art's role in this is. Then there's just this process of embedding, just embedding this conversation in places where it will move things forward or just make people glad to find it a little richer. The way when I read the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert's collected poems, and I found in there one, so, he lived in Poland all his life, but he came to California, he came to Muir Woods, which I can hike to from my house over one ridge, and there is a log with, a redwood tree with the historical years of certain rings named. And I found his poem with that. And that's my log. And this Polish poet wrote about it and made it known in Poland. It just made me happy, to discover this. And so Poets for Science, which began as what I thought was going to be a one-day thing. We had a tent on the mall. We offered workshops. We created human-sized banners of poems addressing science in many different disciplines. They were all over the outside of the tent. They were all over the inside of the tent. We offered writing workshops and opportunities. And you could see the people pouring onto the mall who were there to support science, which was under attack. And you could see them see this tent with the words Poets for Science on it, and they would look very perplexed, kind of, Poets for Science, what? And then they'd be interested, and then they'd come and they'd start reading the poems, and you could see their faces change. Because, there might be some poem addressing their very discipline that they had never known anybody had written a poem about. So we thought we'd done it for one day, and by the next night, those human-sized poem banners had been requested for Maria Popova's Universe in Verse event in Brooklyn. We sent them up to New York on a bus full of returning protesters. And we sort of figured out at that point, so my partner in this is the Wick Poetry Center at Kent State, who is very good about bringing poems to public places. I sent an email to him saying, do you think anyone would help me? And he said, we will. And so I have an institutional partner, which really helps. Well, next year's our 10-year anniversary. We have gone everywhere from a high school environmental poetry festival held at the John Muir National Monument to, I think there's still a poem banner or two on display at the Institute for Natural History in Prescott, Arizona. We have been at the Broad Neuroscience Institute in Boston. We have been at Vanderbilt University's College Department of Engineering, for some reason, decided to host Poets for Science as an installation. And we've been at the National Academy of Sciences, where it was installed for 6 months, and we did not only an event for them, but an event for a Nobel Science Summit, which was held there. So just keep making it available, and people will come. We're talking now, I have no idea if this is actually going to happen or not, but you know, the Santa Fe Institute, which is the complexity theory people, yeah, they're talking, you know, might or might not happen. But this is what you can do, and it all is, as Nalini said, talk to someone, you know, and people find out about things. And any of you who write poems with any kind of science part in them, the poetsforscience.org website, poetsforscience.org, has places where you can post your poems. We're creating this reservoir of available poems, sometimes hashtagged for what area of science they're for. Just put it up there. I have no idea who's using it. We're just making it available. And the caliber of the poems is amazing, and people are putting things up from all over the world. I don't know how they find out about it, but it just moves me that this is happening.
Thanks, Jane. John and Jody, do you want to add anything to this question about what kind of projects we might want to see and develop?
I'd just like to respond to a couple of things that were said. I'm so glad to hear about Poets for Science. That's really encouraging. And also when you were talking about landscape ecology and the relationship between ecosystems, the little I know about it, but is that at the edge between systems, the ecotone, you have unique biotic and mass richness, right? And that's an interesting thing, that when you get to the place where you have some organisms from each side, then that's a different environment. And putting this together, and also I was at the Andrews Forest too, and it was great to be living in a cold little cabin and writing and be told by the ranger, when you go out for your run, don't go over there because there's a mountain lion that lies up in that tree and jumps on deer when they go under. So it was vivid, but the point I want to raise here is, it seems to me, in terms of getting out of our bubble, part of it is going physically to a different place. Because at one point when environmental studies was getting started, I went to a big university in the East where I was invited by their environmental studies program, which was housed in the biology department, which had more faculty than the entire faculty of Middlebury College. And I said, well, you know, I'm glad to come here. This is fun. You're doing all kinds of good things, but you've got 2 people in your English department who'd be great to bring in, and somebody from your divinity school. I said, we can't talk to those people. It's sort of like castles on the Rhine, you know, at a really big research university. They have their own deal, and it's like a college, a department, as you know, Alison. But so we need to get out of our place. And one of the things I've liked to do, and you all do it in different ways, is to teach outside. I've taught a couple of classes where we walked the Long Trail in the summer and camped and talked and wrote and cooked for each other and got cold and took care of each other and just shifted the conversation. You talked about the humbling realization of that who was it in California, the little critter? The gophers, yeah. Well, in Vermont, that's beavers. You know, hurricanes do a lot, fire does a lot. The big changers of the landscape are beavers. So we need to have a humble, outside of our environment way to go. And I think that traveling classes, outdoor adventures are, in the first place, it's great educationally because very few people really like sitting inside all day long. They like adventuring and using their muscles. So that might be just a practical aspect of this.
Could I ask one more question? Don't mean to introduce, but just to go back to Jane. Wondering, I've often found that having a one-on-one relationship between a scientist and a poet is really valuable. And I used to call them, I'd love to have a pet poet, but that didn't go over too well. And so now I call them companion poets or a companion journalist. And I'm wondering what, and then every poet should have a pet ecologist, exactly. But I'm wondering whether with your organization, if you have not only the pool of poems that anybody can use, but do you have a listing, like a directory of scientists or poets who would be interested in forging and maintaining a relationship with someone from the other side?
We do not have any kind of roster of anything.
Okay.
But we do have the list of all the places we go.
Uh-huh.
So there's a history, and those scientists, it's sort of like, so yeah, I was embedded with the neuroscience department in 2013. We're still friends and we still do events together.
Right.
But I don't know that people want to be on a public list of, I volunteer, because everybody is so busy.
Right.
But it's a good idea.
Jody, do you want to jump into this?
I'm not sure I have anything to add, actually. So
That's cool.
I will stay out.
That's all right. We need to move on. It's been a long and beautiful afternoon, and I think we'll skip some of the things we might have talked about, because we could go on for a long time, and I know everybody has a life beyond this room. But I do want to mention that these kind of collaborative efforts are going on in many, many artistic disciplines. And one of the most exciting ones I found at the University of Arizona was an Australian composer, Lachlan Skipworth, used data from the tree ring lab at the University of Arizona to compose a new piece of classical music for 4 strings that was built on the algorithms that came from the data of 4 trees that were suffering the effects of climate change in the desert. So it was just sort of mind-blowing, math, music, and bringing it together in something that is beautiful and also expresses in a very different language a kind of identification with and empathy with the tree. So anyway, you can go hunting and find so many wonderful things that are going on. We're going to run out of time, but I don't want to skip the hard stuff. And I'd like to ask us to move a little bit toward the questions about activism, and where the simplest level of the question is environmental poetry a form of activism? But a little more developed question about that. Let me ask you, what respective roles between science and poetry can play in fueling activism and helping to keep us from going numb to the data about the velocity and peril of change and the extinction crisis? So can poetry fuel activism? In what way can these collaborative alliances fuel our activism at a time when we know we need activism? Who's the brave soul who'd like to pick up that? John, you're looking so ready.
Well, I'll just say I think that the language of poetry is important here, and something that I tried to touch on in my little presentation. I think that the context for this meeting, moving into action, is grief. I read, there was an article some time ago now of Orion Magazine about the fact that ecologists are often in mourning because they know about things that most people don't know about, and they see what's happening to them. And the language of grief, there's a person, again, another person I cut at the last minute out of my presentation. Her name is Lauren Markham, and she just wrote a book called Immemorial. And it's about the way in which we can see all around us beautiful ecosystems that are in danger of extinction. So what we have to do is apply our imagination to imagining them as gone, and then in remembering them, feel their preciousness. So she also says in that book, grief plus hope equals action. And I think that, again, the language of poetry and the knowledge about endangerment, I really do think in general, I mean, beyond this topic, I think the only end to polarization in America, if we ever get there, is meeting in grief. because I think there's a lot of grief, though differently perceived and expressed. So anyway, that's one thought.
Thank you.
I would like to say something. First of all, I think you're right, John. I also think that a lot of people are watching Stephen Colbert these days. And I think that grief and some place where there is something that lifts one out of grief, humor, I don't know. Things have to be with the grief to make it bearable, I think. And I feel like poetry isn't discourse. Poetry, the language of poetry operates differently from the language of discourse. And in the way that the language of poetry operates, how do I say this? It's as though the grief we're feeling can turn the poetry into, can make one want the poetry to be activist. And I guess my model here, I'm sorry, I'm just stumbling through this as I'm thinking it, but I'm thinking of someone like Paul Celan, who in his response to unbearable grief wrenched his German language in ways that had never worked before, and did it so beautifully, and changed so much about poetics. And that was his tool was language. That was what he had to work with, not discourse, but the language of poetry, like where language starts. Poetry is where language starts. It's where it's the origin of it. And he went there. He went to that very base, and he did things that had never been done before. And I feel like there's the level in which we can work as a community, and all these collaborations can happen, and that's exciting and wonderful. And then there's the level at which we as poets work with our tool at the very deepest level, because we are so, this has taken us there. And we have to ask at the very deepest level, what can language do? What can it do differently? And that's where it's like this situation radicalizes poetry. And I guess I want to put that out there as the other side of this, right? Okay.
Thanks.
So I will say a little story. So I can't even remember what it stands for, but there's a worldwide organization, ASLE, which is the something something for literature and the environment. And they have meetings all over the world, not just in America.
Association for the Study of Literature and
Thank
the
you.
Environment.
There we
ASLE.
go. I knew somebody would have it in their head. And when I did that, when it was at UC Davis, the poetry session was the very last thing on the entire conference schedule. And when we got to the Q&A, a man stood up, said, "I work for NASA, and every day we are looking at these issues of environmental catastrophe, and no one ever speaks there of their grief. And I want to thank you for giving me a place where grief has come forward." So that's just one example of how that comes to be. I want to add two things. One is, what I sort of alluded to before, which was facts are only meaningful to us when we feel them. Science must be objective. You perform your experiment and you must be willing to take failure as an answer. But even so, it is the emotional response that tells you if a result is meaningful and if it requires something more of you. I love what Jody said, that, let us not disrespect the making of the poems themselves, from which all of the rest of this comes, or the doing of the science itself. But I want to add something to grief plus hope equals action is fantastic, but I want to add another element to that, which is akin to what Jody said, which is, I feel that the antidote to despair is a sense of agency. It is the feeling that we cannot do anything which causes people to despair. And if you can put new words together in a new way to create meaning that did not exist before, that is agency. It is agency if you are the Turkish poet Hikmet, 10 years in a prison cell, not knowing where you are going to come out. It is agency if you are watching or have watched your home community burn to the ground from a wildfire. Agency is having a response that involves creativity and being awake to the world. And by the time you've done that, you are no longer in a state of only despair. Poems make the unbearable bearable. Poems of death have beauty in them. Poems of beauty have death in them. It is the job of art to allow us to continue when you might not be able to open your eyes in the morning. Maybe you can't open your eyes, maybe it's all unbearable. And then a little phrase comes knocking, the gopher of the new phrase. And then you have your
Turning up
agency
your
back,
field.
and then you begin to act.
Thanks. Nalini?
Yeah, just to take this maybe one step further from just grief or grief and poetry and grief and agency, I think that something that ecologists can bring to this is the understanding that disturbance, and I think what we're all experiencing is ecological, environmental disturbance. We're seeing social disturbance. We're seeing disturbance in our spiritual world as despair comes into everything we do. We don't have any control over disturbances. You know, we can't unelect people who are doing things that are not helping the earth. We can't stop a car accident from happening. We can't stop the death of our mothers, but we can have some agency, I think, in how we respond to those disturbances. And I think that science, and especially ecology, can help us find examples in nature that show us that a disturbance can result in something generative. A forest fire does result in the release of seeds to germinate and to form the next generation of that forest, which might look different for some time, but eventually it will grow into the old growth forest that we have lost through disturbance. A raging flood can wipe out soils, but there can be regeneration in terms of the vegetation that comes back along those banks. A divorce can happen in your life, and you can then find perhaps somebody else in your life that you create something new in terms of your relationship to a person or people. And so I think that we can use science and ecology as examples of nature and its resilience and its coming back, but not just coming back to what it was or wishing it would come back to the way it was, or wishing a political arena would come back to the way that it was when somebody else was in power, but instead of saying, what can we regenerate into that's new? What is going to be our third state? Not the original state, not the early disturbed state, but some new third state that would not have been possible without the stopping of that disturbance. And so I would like to think about the ways that both scientists, ecologists, and poets can help us, if not envision, at least make a promise that there will be a third state, because in almost every case, we're not going to go back to the old state. We're not going to be going back to pre-COVID. We're going to go back, we're going to go on to some third state that is not necessarily better or worse than what is before, but it is different. And I think if we can approach that with the tools of poetry, the tools of science, with the promise of whatever this third state might be, it will keep us from getting embedded in that despair or into some false hope that may never happen. So I think that's where I see these partnerships with the poets being so able to express, and scientists so rooted in the facts that they observe and experiment with, that's really a promise that I see as being positive.
That's so helpful. Thank you so much, because there's the activism of taking apart pathological and corrupt systems, but there's the activism of building and helping to build what comes after disturbance. So that's super, super helpful. Thank you. Well, we're going to wind up here, but I'm going to ask for a very quick popcorn round here, because I want to remind you and give you some gifts to take with you, to remember that you can turn to science to forgetting that wow factor, to re-enliven you to the world and to look at the things of the world. So I'm going to ask each of our brilliant and esteemed panelists to whom I am deeply grateful. If they could offer us one quick take of something they have heard in the news from science that made them either want to write a poem or has already made them write a poem, what was that quick little thing, like the slime mold, building a map of the Tokyo subway? Should we just run down the line here?
Is it okay that I didn't hear it from the news?
Yes, of course it is.
Okay. So I was just with the consummate environmental writer Rick Bass being shown his old-growth black ram forest that he has been trying to, for decades, to save from logging in northwest Montana. And Rick gives you an education when he brings you into the forest. And what I learned, which I thought was really fascinating, was that two things, sorry, popcorn, two popcorns. The arboreal northern forests are a more efficient and harder working reservoir of carbon than the Amazon, which I had not realized because they're slow. They're slow. And the other thing that I learned was that the Yak Valley, his beloved Yak Valley, it is one of the, if you put aside volcanic islands, it is one of the newest places of biological life on Earth because it was under a glacier until 8,000 years ago. And so this old growth forest is on some of the newest soil earth, or technically, as he said, because it's not broken down enough to be soil yet, organic matter. These trees are growing in organic matter that exists on the earth. 8,000 years ago, glacier. Now, magnificent climax forest. And 8,000 years, you know, human cities were already on this earth. It's so new. So I was pretty thrilled by that, and I am supposed to have left this introduction and at some point write something in response to it. But don't wait for me. Go to Ada Limon's poem, The Origin of Everything, which she wrote after having been taken in by him last year. And it's such a great poem. Okay.
Well, what I read about in the newspaper that I think would make for great poetry is recent studies on the intelligence of fish. Birds I got because I've seen ravens, and animals are furry and warm like us, and many of them, and that, so they must be smart. Fish are intelligent in many ways. I'd like to know more about this, and poets will lead the way.
Beautiful. Thank you. The fish, thank you.
I'm sorry, Alison. I'm not answering this again, but I read the question and I immediately flashed back. This will come full circle to graduate school at Cornell with Ammons, and he came into class one day, and he said, this was the graduate workshop, and he said, I was just reading this really great article on bees, on the nature of the hive, and he said, a hive is a poetics. Anything can be a poetics. And
Thank you.
Well, someone from the Beehive State, I really appreciate that. Utah is the Beehive State. This isn't so much a report from a scientific article or a news story, but I do want to share it with you because I'm really excited about it, and that is a group of scientists within National Geographic, and I'm sort of leading this effort, is we're starting a new initiative. You know, you might have heard of the Big Cats Initiative at National Geographic or the Pristine Seas, but this is called Our Trees, and it's really a storytelling-based, sort of poetry-based effort to collect the personal stories, the scientific stories, the indigenous stories, the art stories, the humanities stories that have to do with trees and forests, to put those together, to integrate them, and to create materials that can incite action on behalf of trees. And I love the fact that some of the most hardcore scientists within National Geographic and funded by National Science Foundation are saying, yeah, storytelling is the way we need to go. Bring on the poems, bring on the stories, because I think there's this understanding that that is a powerful driver in terms of inciting actions to help us with what's going on in ecology and with forests today. So if you want to submit a personal story or any kind of story, just go to www.our-trees.com. So it's our-trees.com. You can submit a story by typing in text or submitting an audio file or taking a picture of your favorite tree or making a video and sending that in for consumption by a wide variety of people. Yeah, it can be a visual story.
Thank you. I've got the slime molds. They like to eat oatmeal, and so you just put oatmeal flakes at each of the, you have a map of the city, and in your model of the city, you put oatmeal flakes at each of the stations of the Tokyo subway. The slime mold will move to get the oatmeal, and it gives a map of the subway system. And other urban centers have used this methodology because sometimes the slime mold finds a more efficient way to get from here to there than urban planners. So here's to the slime molds. Thank you.
Just to close up. So you just heard, as I heard, this fascinating, inspiring, and far-ranging conversation. And what a brilliant afternoon it's been. One more round of applause for these folks.